So in the last video, we were looking at how the new woman begins to redefine herself as a public figure, and how the new woman is sort of a synthesis of an image presented by advertising, but also, in other words, presented through the lens of the male way of presenting this, and the woman's way of presenting herself on her own terms. So if you look at the qualities of the new woman, obviously she isn't there to be pleasing the man. She's got her own, as the bicycle would suggest, she's physically active. She is independent. She is autonomous. All these elements, which we're going to talk today more about the political expression of this. It begins with the cultural expression of independence and self-determination. And it begins then to expand into other things. So as we were looking at before, as women begin to move into education and social work and things like that, you begin to see women like Jane Addams and Ellen Starr, two women who begin to set up settlement houses. These were homes for immigrants, particularly for women. So this was creating an alliance between upper middle class women and working class women around raising children, social clubs, how to teach kids to be active, literally teaching hygiene through public baths, boarding houses and things like that. And if you look at the picture below, this is sort of using the kind of Victorian middle class standards to help school immigrants in American culture. So this idea of municipal housekeeping was a very brilliant way of taking the domestic sphere, where women were perfectly allowed, at least from a male perspective, to be involved in. So the idea of moral superiority that came from the cult of domesticity, and the idea that women had a special role to play in that sphere. You're just saying, okay, well, if the whole city is like a house, then municipal housekeeping is just, it's just taking care of a larger house. So obviously Hull House was a larger house, but as they move into these settlement houses, they also get involved in public policy, everything from trash removal to school policies. And this is going to get women into politics at the local level. And it begins there. And this is sort of this before you even get to suffrage at a national level. You have a lot of local women's activism through things like Hull House. Now, as you move towards suffrage, you have sort of a generational split here. The new woman, the more aggressive, autonomous, radical woman, represented by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. They were women who were much more willing to take more aggressive and radical actions for the sake of suffrage. Carrie Chapman Catt, as the picture would suggest, was an older woman who was very interested in a political solution to getting the vote, but she was more about going sort of old school in the way that you would mobilize state and local suffrage associations and try to garner support of men in more less confrontational ways. So obviously there's going to be a generational split in the suffrage movement, and like anything, most movements have a radical side and a more moderate side. You can think about it like the Dr. King, Malcolm X divide in the civil rights movement. You need both for the movement to be successful. So obviously it's going to be Alice Paul and Lucy Burns who are going to be the ones who are going to be overseeing the White House pickets. And this happens during World War I. And as they begin to point out the hypocrisy that America's fighting for democracy abroad but not supporting it at home, is a very big piece of this. So they're out in front of the White House. They are actively picketing, and they're acting again more aggressively. They get criticized for this, but their idea is that kind of political activism is necessary for them to get what they want. Now, what ends up happening, of course, is that the suffragettes end up getting imprisoned for disorderly behavior, blocking traffic, and they get discredited by mainstream media as being radical feminists. So radical feminist is seen as, okay, you can be a feminist, but only as long as you do it in the way that Carrie Chapman Catt was, sort of if you're a little bit more willing to adopt some of the traditional aspects of what it means to be a woman. But radical feminists were seen as the source of the problem. So this rejection of the traditional female role leads to imprisonment for many of these women, and then ultimately to force-feeding, imprisonment, really horrible things that happen, to really abusive actions by the US government. So this force-feeding occurs and is covered in the press, and is seen as a form of martyrdom for the suffragettes, and particularly amongst women themselves, it was seen as almost like a badge of honor. So what you're beginning to see here is that as suffrage becomes more mainstream, you begin to see the new woman and the more aggressive approach begins to work. Now, to personalize this a little bit, Blanche Ames, my great-grandmother, was an important suffragette in Massachusetts. She did a lot of political cartoons, was realized that there was a strong connection between birth control and understanding of women's bodies was a key piece to liberation. So she felt that there was a two-pronged aspect to women's suffrage. One was getting the vote, the other was getting women the understanding of how to take control of their lives. So what ends up happening here is the suffragettes go on a state-by-state basis. It's interesting that the Western states are first, in part because there's less gender differentiation, at least in some of those rural environments early on. I know that we just talked about gender differences solidifying, which they do later, but in the 19th century, at least on the frontier, women were necessary, and in order to incorporate the states, you had to count as many people as possible. So counting women allowed the states to incorporate earlier. So they had political power and influence earlier in the West. And you can see it sort of moves from west to east as far as the suffrage movement goes. And Tennessee is the ultimate state that decides suffrage and allows, the 38th state allows for suffrage to move forward. So at the end of the day, you've got suffrage on one side, women trying to begin to redefine themselves both politically and socially, but at the same time, you have something happening with men too. So while women are out in the streets and advocating for their rights, as you see the suffragettes in white on the right, on the left, you see men starting to engage in wrestling and boxing, football. This idea of that manhood has to be earned and developed, which is really interesting. So this idea of having to reestablish your gender identity. So as women became more assertive and began to take jobs in the public sphere, men felt threatened. And so they felt that because the subordination was a fear, that they had to go out and fight for their manhood and literally work on developing it. So ironically, as women begin to develop different forms of gender identity, men begin to double down on the traditional form of male identity. So when you look at manhood, obviously it was traditionally defined by physical toughness and aggressiveness and violence and sexual virility and power, which of course was dangerous to women because in order to prove your manhood, you frequently would be doing things that would involve some form of sexual assault or sometimes unwanted sexual advances. We already have talked about the traditional female qualities in the cult of domesticity, which are listed on the right. So what happens is that men begin to engage in all of these new forms of manhood, whether it's hunting or shooting or riding or boxing. And Teddy Roosevelt epitomizes all of this, right? He was a big-time hunter, loved to shoot, loved to ride horses. He boxed while he was at Harvard. He boxed while he was in the White House. So these, again, the participation in sports becomes a big piece of what it means to be a man. And the cult of the strenuous life means that, look, if you're going to go, sit around at a desk all day, that's going to challenge your manhood. So particularly men in middle class and upper middle class positions had to develop their manhood. So all of these things, in fact, I think Roosevelt did all of the things listed there. For new women, obviously, the idea was to get educated, to remain physically aware of your appearance, to enter into the cultural realm. So artists and writers, there's going to be a lot. If you look at Roosevelt, for example, she becomes a writer and an artist. Blanche Ames was an artist. The sharing of parental responsibilities, obviously asking men to do more, that was very charged at the time. But the political activism was a big piece of what it meant to be a new woman. So what's interesting is that gender roles are being defined in opposition to one another. The other issue threatening the dominance of white Protestants, again, radical unionism, immigration, the changing of women's roles, but bureaucratic jobs were a big thing. That was something about this that sort of drained men of their manhood. So it's interesting, just as men begin to become more sedentary in their jobs, they begin to move out of the fields and into the office. You have the return of the cult of the cowboy, which comes just as the cowboy itself begins to disappear. So you see all of these pictures of Roosevelt, as the cowboy in the Spanish-American War, and this whole idea of, the knight and the cowboy being the same thing, and again, sort of defense of the race and defense of all of these things. So if you look at Remington, who was a famous artist in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the cowboy becomes a symbol of this sort of triumphant individual, right, that's threatened by the city but becomes glorified in art and even in literature. So Roosevelt, of course, is the classic example of a guy who, as a boy, his mother dressed him in dresses and in effeminate clothing. He wasn't very strong physically. His dad points it out to him when he's young and says, you're quite weak. You got to make a man of yourself. I think those are his direct words. And Roosevelt does that. He starts to lift weights. He goes out west. He adopts this cowboy persona. He adopts all the elements of the new man. He boxes. He plays football. He engages in the strenuous life. He goes through to fight with the Rough Riders. Proves his manhood in the way that his dad hadn't, because his dad hadn't fought in the Civil War. And of course, the other sport that's going to be key to this new construction of manhood is going to be football. Football, which is a sport originally for rich white guys, not a sport as you see today being played by working class white people and African Americans and black people. So again, the earning of manhood through a sport that kind of mirrored the values of imperialism, right? Taking land. Literally has a whole kind of martial element to it. That if you think about it, the whole idea is to scoring a touchdown. It's all about having control of the field. There's a very militaristic element to the whole game. So we've just talked about the connection to imperialism and social Darwinism, but you can see here the game was originally played without face masks and becomes a very popular game amongst the Ivy Leagues, and it starts off as a college game. Now, the other thing that happens is the Boy Scouts come into play here. This idea of preparing young boys for work and citizenship. So getting them outside, away from the city, that the way to develop young men is to get them out of the urban environment, get them back into nature. So the scouting movement becomes a huge part of this idea of recreation of manhood and recreation of what it means to be a man. Summer camps, again, the original idea here, particularly for boys, they were gender segregated in the early 20th century. It was about living a strenuous life outside, and this whole idea was tied to the scouting movement. So there's more to talk about here. Running out of time. Obviously, boxing is going to be a big piece of this, and as you move towards these more baseball and boxing particularly, it's going to engage immigrants in a whole new definition of manhood.